There's something deeply uncomfortable about this entire Anita and Vernon storyline on Beyond the Gates. And honestly, that's exactly why it works so well. Because on the surface, this looked like a simple argument between a husband trying to protect his wife and a woman desperately trying to reclaim her life after cancer nearly stole it from her. But the deeper this episode went, the more I realized this wasn't really about surgery. It was about control. Who gets to decide when survival becomes living again? And that is where the writing suddenly became far more intelligent than people might initially give it credit for. Anita walking into that conversation after finishing her final round of chemotherapy felt emotionally triumphant. You could feel her urgency through the screen. She wasn't just excited, she was emotionally starving for normalcy. After weeks or months of treatments, weakness, nausea, sores, exhaustion, and fear, she wanted one thing: momentum. She wanted the tumor out immediately. And honestly, who wouldn't? That's what made Vernon's reaction so frustrating at first. Because when Anita said she wanted to go to the hospital and take control of her life again, Vernon's hesitation almost sounded cruel. For a second, I think the audience is supposed to feel angry at him. Anita finally reaches a moment of hope, and suddenly he becomes the obstacle. That's a dangerous emotional setup. But then the scene keeps unfolding, and the writing quietly flips the perspective. Because Vernon is not trying to control Anita. He's terrified of losing her. That distinction matters a lot. And I think the smartest thing this episode did was refuse to make either of them completely right or completely wrong. Anita's logic is emotionally valid. After chemotherapy, patients often cling to milestones because those milestones become psychological lifelines. The surgery represents victory to her. Removing the tumor means removing the fear, removing the uncertainty, removing the visible reminder that her body betrayed her. So when Vernon says slow down, Anita doesn't hear caution. She hears limitation. She hears illness again. She hears someone telling her she's still weak. That's why her declaration about driving again hit so hard. On paper, it sounds small, but emotionally, that moment was huge. She wasn't talking about driving. She was talking about independence, about identity, about no longer being treated like a fragile patient. And yet, Vernon wasn't wrong either. That's the uncomfortable brilliance here. He points out that she just finished chemotherapy. Her body is exhausted. She admits she's nauseous. She admits she's in pain. She admits she's still physically struggling. Vernon isn't denying her autonomy, he's reacting to reality. And this is where the show sneaks into something surprisingly mature. Love and fear often look identical from the outside. A person trying to protect you can accidentally suffocate you. A person fighting for freedom can accidentally ignore danger. Both things can be true at the same time. That's real life. And soap operas don't always trust silence and emotional contradiction enough to explore that complexity. But this episode actually did. What really elevated the storyline for me, though, was Dr. Bauer's entrance into the situation. Because the doctor immediately grounded the emotional chaos with medical reality. Suddenly, the conversation stopped being symbolic and became procedural. Mammograms, ultrasounds, MRI scans, measuring the tumor, evaluating options. And I think that shift was very important structurally because it exposed something subtle about Anita's mindset. She was psychologically treating the end of chemotherapy as the end of the war. But medically, the war may not even be close to over. That realization hit Anita like a truck. You could literally feel the emotional air leave the room once Dr. Bauer began explaining that surgery decisions depended entirely on the upcoming test results. Then came the devastating layer underneath it all, the possibility of removing her ovaries and fallopian tubes, and potentially even both breasts. That's when this storyline stopped being about survival and started becoming about identity erosion. Because, let's be honest, the show is tapping into one of the most terrifying realities. Cancer patients face the fear that surviving may require becoming physically unrecognizable to yourself. And this is why Vernon's behavior suddenly becomes more understandable in retrospect. I don't think Vernon was scared of the surgery itself. I think he was scared of what comes after. People keep framing him as overly protective, but I actually think he sees something Anita doesn't want to confront yet. She's emotionally sprinting toward a finish line that may not exist. That's brutal, but it's probably true. And this is where the writing gets quietly heartbreaking. Anita wants certainty. The doctors can't give her certainty. Vernon can't give her certainty. Nobody can. So she clings to action instead. That's psychologically believable. When humans face fear they cannot control, they often obsess over the few decisions they can control. Surgery becomes symbolic power. Driving becomes symbolic power. Making fast decisions becomes symbolic power. Anita is trying to reclaim ownership over a body that cancer turned into a battlefield. Once you see it through that lens, her intensity makes complete sense. But here's the twist I don't think enough viewers are talking about. Vernon may actually be the only character treating Anita like a human being instead of a symbol. Think about it. Everyone around Anita understandably wants positivity, hope, strength, victory, recovery, inspiration. But Vernon sees exhaustion, fragility, fear, mortality. He sees the part nobody wants to say out loud. And because he sees it, he becomes the bad guy in the conversation. That's fascinating writing, especially because the show smartly avoids making Vernon overly controlling. In the end, it still goes with Anita. He still supports her. He still encourages her. He still wants the best possible outcome for her. That matters because it prevents the storyline from collapsing into a cliche husband controlling wife narrative. Instead, it becomes something sadder and more realistic. Two people coping with fear in opposite ways. Anita attacks fear through action. Vernon attacks fear through caution. Neither method actually removes the fear. And honestly, that's probably the most emotionally honest part of this entire story. Now, I do think there's one potentially controversial issue with the writing that deserves discussion. The pacing. Emotionally, Anita goes from triumphant confidence to devastating medical anxiety very quickly. For some viewers, that tonal shift may feel abrupt. One minute she's determined to reclaim her life, the next she's spiraling over the possibility of losing her breasts and reproductive organs. But personally, I think the whiplash was intentional. Cancer IS emotional whiplash. You can feel hopeful at breakfast and terrified by lunch. The problem isn't necessarily the speed, it's whether the show gives Anita enough space afterward to process these fears beyond dramatic dialogue. That's the real test. If the series rushes past her psychological conflict just to move the plot forward, then this storyline loses power because the emotional consequences here are massive. We're talking about body image, womanhood, aging, mortality, intimacy, identity, autonomy, all colliding at once. That deserves breathing room. And interestingly, the Mona scene may be the clue that the writers understand this. At first glance, Mona wanting to start a cancer support group at the church seemed like a softer side moment inserted to calm the tension. But I actually think it serves a deeper narrative function. It introduces community into Anita's journey. Up until now, Anita's battle has felt intensely private, mainly filtered through Vernon and medical conversations. But support groups fundamentally change the emotional landscape because they force characters to confront shared vulnerability. And shared vulnerability destroys denial. That's important. Because Anita is still trying to operate like someone who can beat this through willpower and determination alone, but healing is rarely that linear. Sometimes strength looks less like fighting and more like admitting you're scared. I suspect the support group storyline could become transformative for her character if the show commits to it properly. And honestly, that's the direction I hope they take. Not because I want more suffering for Anita, quite the opposite. I want the show to resist the temptation to turn her into a perfect inspirational survivor archetype. Those characters often stop feeling human. What makes Anita compelling right now is that she's messy, impatient, proud, scared, determined, vulnerable, contradictory, human. That complexity is carrying this entire storyline. And maybe the biggest irony of all is this. Anita keeps saying she wants her old life back, but surviving something like this changes people permanently. There may not be an old normal waiting for her anymore. That's the truth Vernon might already understand. And maybe that's why he looks so worried the entire time. Not because he doubts Anita's strength, but because he knows strength alone cannot guarantee the ending you want. And honestly, that final realization lingers harder than any dramatic argument ever could.